My daughter's husband grabbed her by the shoulders and forced her back into her chair at Sunday dinner. She didn't scream. She didn't even flinch. She just went still, the way a person does when they've been trained to disappear. And across the table, his mother clapped her hands together softly and said, "Amen. That boy knows how to lead." I said nothing. I set my glass down, folded my hands in my lap, and watched. They mistook my silence for surrender. They had no idea what I used to do for a living. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. I hadn't seen my daughter Rachel in 5 weeks when her husband called. Not Rachel. Connor. He said they were having a family dinner Saturday evening, 7 o'clock, and that it would mean a lot to Rachel if I came. He didn't say it would mean a lot to him. I noticed that. I've spent most of my adult life noticing things other people think are invisible. It's what they paid me to do. I drove to their house in Buckhead that evening with the kind of careful hope you carry at 64 when you've already buried one person you loved, my wife Linda, and you don't want to watch another person you love slowly vanish. The neighborhood was old money Atlanta. Wide lawns, magnolia trees that had been there longer than any of the families. The kind of street where everyone knows everyone's business and pretends they don't. Connor had bought the house with a down payment his mother helped with. A fact he mentioned at every opportunity, as though generosity came with a receipt he expected the world to acknowledge. Rachel answered the door. She looked thin in a way that worried me. Not the thin of someone who exercises. The thin of someone who forgets to eat because she's too busy reading someone else's mood, adjusting to someone else's silence, making herself small enough to avoid whatever's coming. She smiled when she saw me, and for just a second it was real, the kind of smile that comes from somewhere deep and unguarded before the surface pulls it back. "Dad." She hugged me tight and held on a moment longer than usual, the way you hold something you're afraid of losing. "Hey, sweetheart." I squeezed her back, felt her shoulder blades under my palms, like the wings of something that hadn't flown in a long time. "You look tired." "I'm fine." She said it quickly, the way people say things they've rehearsed. "Come in." The house smelled like roasted chicken and candles, the version of home you create when company is coming. Everything arranged. Everything performed. I'd been in enough crime scenes to know that the most dangerous rooms in America often smell like dinner and fresh flowers. I'm not saying this was a crime scene. Not yet. But I was reading the room the way I'd read rooms for 28 years, and nothing I was reading made me feel at ease. Maya came around the corner from the living room. My granddaughter, 8 years old. Brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing sock feet and a purple shirt with a cat on it. She used to be the kind of child who announced herself from 3 rooms away. She used to narrate everything. Her drawings, her snacks, the plots of cartoons I'd never heard of. She used to fill every silence with observations that were so startlingly accurate, I'd sometimes forget she was a child. She didn't do any of that. She walked toward me quietly, almost carefully. And when she reached me, she didn't speak. She just took my hand and held it. Her fingers were small and warm, and they wrapped around mine with the kind of grip that isn't about strength, it's about need. "Hey there, Maya Bird." That was my name for her. Had been since she was 2, and spent an entire afternoon trying to convince me she could fly if I'd just throw her high enough. She looked up at me. Those eyes. Linda's eyes, exactly. The same deep brown with gold flecks that caught the light. She didn't say hello. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me the way someone looks at a door they're hoping will open. Over her head, I saw Rachel watching us from the hallway. Her expression was something I couldn't name at first. Then, I could. It was the expression of a woman watching 2 people she loved find each other, and being afraid that even this small, good thing might somehow be taken from her. "She's been waiting for you all week," Rachel said softly. "Smart kid." I smoothed Maya's hair. "Gets it from her mother's side." Rachel almost smiled at that. Almost. Connor appeared from the kitchen in a pressed shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms. He was a big man, 6'2". broad-shouldered. The kind of build that fills a doorway and knows it. He extended his hand. Firm grip. Direct eye contact. The kind of handshake men give when they want you to understand something about the hierarchy of the room you've just entered. James. Good to see you. He called me James. Not Mr. Morrow. Not Dad. James, like I was a colleague he was tolerating at a networking event. Connor. I shook his hand and released it. His mother was already seated at the dining room table when we walked in. Dolores Tate was a woman in her late 60s who carried herself like someone who had opinions about everything and considered all of them final. She wore a silk blouse and pearls and perfume that reached you before she did. The kind of fragrance that functions less as scent and more as territory. She looked up when I entered. She didn't stand, James. She offered the kind of smile you give to someone you've already decided doesn't matter. The kind of smile that says, I see you, and I've filed you under irrelevant. Dolores. I took a seat across from her and accepted the glass of water Rachel poured for me. Rachel poured water for everyone. No one said thank you. I noticed that too. In 28 years of studying human behavior, I'd learned that the most important things in a room are almost never the things people say out loud. They're the things that happen in between. The glass of water no one acknowledges. The chair positioned slightly further from the table. The child who used to talk constantly and now holds her grandfather's hand in silence. I noticed all of it. And I said nothing. Because I'd spent my career being most effective when the people I was observing believed I wasn't paying attention. Dinner started the way most dangerous situations do. Pleasantly. Rachel had made everything from scratch. Roasted chicken with rosemary. Green beans with almonds. A salad with vinaigrette she'd clearly spent time on. Fresh bread that was still warm. I watched her set the last dish on the table and step back slightly. The way someone does when they're presenting work for evaluation. Not sharing a meal. Submitting one. Connor cut into his chicken without a word. Didn't comment on the flavor. Didn't acknowledge the effort. He ate the way people eat when they believe food appears on tables, the same way electricity comes through walls. Automatically. And without requiring gratitude. Dolores picked up her fork, examined the salad, and took a single bite. Is this the vinaigrette I sent you the recipe for? She asked. I adjusted it a little, Rachel said carefully. Added a bit of lemon. The original is always better, Rachel. When someone gives you a recipe that works, the point is to follow it. Dolores set her fork down as though the salad had personally offended her. I don't understand this need to change things that don't need changing. It's delicious, I said. Dolores looked at me briefly. The way you look at a television someone left on in another room, and turned back to Connor. How's the Peachtree project coming along? And just like that, the conversation belonged to Connor. He talked about work the way men like him always do, in numbers designed to impress and terms designed to exclude. A mixed-use development on Peachtree Road. $14 million in projected revenue. Investors from Nashville. He spoke with the easy confidence of someone who had never been interrupted in his own home and didn't intend to start experiencing it now. I listened. I asked one or two questions about the project timeline. Enough to seem engaged, not enough to seem interested. And while I listened, I watched my daughter. Rachel ate small amounts. She cut her food into pieces she mostly rearranged rather than consumed. She tracked Connor's expression the way a person tracks weather. Adjusting her posture, her responses, even her breathing based on the atmospheric pressure of his mood. When he paused, she leaned slightly forward. When his jaw tightened, she leaned back. When he made a joke about a contractor who'd underbid a project and lost his shirt, she laughed a half-second after Dolores did, calibrated to match the room. I'd seen this pattern before. I'd seen it in interview rooms at the Bureau, in the behavioral profiles of domestic violence victims I'd studied for years. The clinical term is hypervigilance, a state in which a person's nervous system is permanently tuned to the emotional frequency of their abuser. They learn to read micro-expressions, the way sailors read weather. Not because they're interested in the forecast, because their survival depends on it. My daughter was surviving. She was doing it at her own dinner table, in her own home, across from a man she'd married. And she was doing it so skillfully that if you weren't trained to see it, you'd think she was simply being a good hostess. I was trained to see it. Maya sat at the far end of the table, eating slowly, her eyes moving between the adults with the quiet attentiveness of a child who has learned that grown-up conversations contain information she needs to monitor. She didn't speak. She didn't fidget. She sat very still and very upright, and processed everything happening around her with a focus that no 8-year-old should have to maintain at a dinner table. In the BAU, we called it ambient absorption. Children in high-conflict homes often develop an almost preternatural ability to read emotional environments. They can feel the temperature of a room shift before adults can identify what changed. It's a survival mechanism. It looks like good behavior. It isn't. It's fear, wearing the mask of obedience. Rachel mentioned you've been doing some tutoring, I said during a pause, trying to open a door that was hers. I'd read it in a text she'd sent me 3 weeks earlier, the most personal thing she'd shared in months. Oh. Rachel looked up, surprised to be addressed directly. Yes, I've been helping some kids in the neighborhood with reading. It's just a few hours a week, but I really enjoy it. She paused. Actually, I wanted to talk about something. Maya's teacher, Mrs. Anderson, she's been wonderful, really wonderful. But she mentioned that Maya might benefit from seeing someone. A child psychologist. Just to talk. Mrs. Anderson said she's been very quiet in class lately, and she thought it might help to have someone Maya could open up to. Rachel said all of this quickly. The way people deliver information they expect to be rejected. She'd rehearsed this. I could tell. She'd probably rehearsed it in the shower, in the car, in the quiet minutes before everyone arrived. She'd probably practiced the phrasing a dozen times, looking for the arrangement of words least likely to provoke a reaction. She brightened as she spoke, though. Something in her voice came alive when she talked about what her daughter needed. For just a moment, the Rachel I remembered surfaced. The Rachel who'd graduated magna cum laude from Emory Law. The Rachel who'd spent 2 years at a human rights nonprofit before Connor convinced her she wasn't needed there anymore. The Rachel who used to argue with me about Supreme Court decisions at this same time of evening, her voice sharp and confident and unafraid. Her teacher thinks it would really help. Rachel continued. There's a practice in Brookhaven that specializes in children. They have a wonderful reputation, and the sessions could work around Maya's school schedule so it wouldn't interfere with anything. I've already looked into the insurance, and it would be mostly covered. So the cost wouldn't be. She was preemptively addressing every objection. Cost, schedule, logistics. She was building a case the way I'd taught her to build cases when she was a teenager, except she wasn't building it for a teacher or a judge. She was building it for her husband. And she was doing it with the careful precision of someone who understood that the wrong word in the wrong moment could change the temperature of the room in ways she couldn't predict. Connor set his knife down. The sound it made against the plate was small and precise, and every person at that table heard it. A psychologist, he said. Not to Rachel. To the table. The way you state a fact about something unreasonable. You want to send my daughter to a psychologist. Not send her. Just let her talk to someone. Mrs. Anderson said. I don't care what Mrs. Anderson said. His voice hadn't risen. That was the thing. It hadn't risen at all. It had lowered. And in my experience, the men who lower their voices are far more dangerous than the men who raise them. The loud ones are losing control. The quiet ones already have it. Dolores set down her water glass and nodded slowly, as though Connor had just quoted scripture. A child psychologist, she repeated, loading the words with disapproval. Honestly, Rachel, a wife who trusts her husband doesn't need outside opinions about how to raise their child. The air at the table changed. I could feel it the way you feel barometric pressure drop before a storm. Something was coming. And my daughter knew it too. I could see it in the way her hands went still around her water glass, in the way her shoulders pulled inward by a fraction of an inch, in the way she stopped breathing for just a moment, calculating, recalculating, deciding whether to continue or to retreat behind the invisible line she'd learned never to cross. She continued. I watched her make the decision in real time. The slight lift of her chin, the small breath she took before speaking, the way her fingers tightened around the water glass, as though bracing for impact. She chose to keep going, and in that moment, I was proud of her and terrified for her in equal measure. Mrs. Anderson has 22 years of experience with children, Rachel said. Her voice was quiet but steady, the voice of someone walking across thin ice who knows exactly how thin it is. She's not saying anything is wrong with Maya. She's saying that sometimes children benefit from having a safe space to talk. That's all. A conversation. A conversation with a stranger, Connor said. About our family. About her feelings. Her feelings are fine. She's 8. She hasn't spoken in class for almost 3 weeks, Connor. The room went still. Rachel had said it. The thing she'd been building toward. The reason she'd rehearsed and preempted and carefully constructed her argument. She'd said it plainly. And now it was in the air between them like something dropped that couldn't be picked back up. And she looked at her. Not the way a husband looks at a wife who's shared a concern. The way a man looks at someone who has stepped out of the space he assigned them. She's shy, he said. She's always been shy. She wasn't shy. Rachel's voice cracked. Just barely. She used to talk all the time. You know that. She used to tell us everything about her day, every detail, every story, and now she doesn't speak at school at all. And I think we should at least consider that something might be, Rachel. His voice dropped another register. A warning. A border. I set down my fork. The girl's teacher knows her students, I said, calmly, conversationally. The way you diffuse a room by refusing to acknowledge that it needs diffusing. If a professional is recommending something, it's worth hearing out. That's all Rachel's saying. Dolores turned to me. The smile she gave me was the kind you give to a dog that's wandered into the dining room. James, she said. With all due respect, raising a child in a family like this requires a certain kind of understanding. Children don't need strangers analyzing them. They need structure. They need a mother who's present and a father who leads. That's what the Lord intended. Maya's teacher isn't a stranger, Rachel said. She sees Maya 5 days a week. She knows her better than her own parents? Dolores raised an eyebrow. That's what you're saying? That's not what I said. It certainly sounded like it. Connor pushed his chair back. The sound scraped against the hardwood floor, and every person at that table registered it the way animals register the snap of a branch in a quiet forest. He stood. He was 6'2", and he used every inch of it. He looked down at Rachel from the full height of his authority and his certainty and his absolute belief that the air in this room belonged to him. We're done talking about this, he said. I just think. He moved. Not wildly. Not the way you see in movies. He moved with the controlled, practiced precision of a man who had done this before and knew exactly how much force to use. He put both hands on Rachel's shoulders and pushed her down into her chair. Firmly, deliberately, the way you close a lid on something you want to stay shut. Rachel went still. Completely, instantly still. Not surprised, not shocked. Trained, the way a person goes still when they've hit the invisible fence enough times that they no longer need the shock to know where the boundary is. They just stop. And then Dolores Tate, seated across the table in her silk blouse and her pearls and her perfume that smelled like gardenias and judgment, clapped her hands together softly. Once. Twice. A small, approving applause. Amen, she said. That boy knows how to lead a household. She picked up her water glass and took a sip, satisfied. Just like his father. A firm hand when it's needed. That's all it takes. Maya didn't move. She sat at the end of the table with her eyes fixed on her plate and her small hand wrapped around her spoon so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She didn't cry. She didn't look up. She didn't make a sound. She had learned, at 8 years old, to make herself so small that she became almost invisible, to fold herself inward until she occupied the least possible space, the least possible attention, the least possible risk. I had spent 28 years studying the behavioral aftermath of violence. I had read thousands of pages of clinical research on the impact of domestic abuse on children. I knew the terminology. I knew the statistics. I knew that children who witness intimate partner violence are 3 to 4 times more likely to develop anxiety disorders, depression, and post-traumatic stress. I knew all of this academically, professionally, with the detached precision of an expert reviewing data. None of that knowledge prepared me for watching my granddaughter disappear into herself at a dinner table while her grandmother applauded the reason why. I looked at Connor. He had already sat back down. He was reaching for his wine glass. He was calm, satisfied. He had restored order in his household, the way he always restored order. Quickly, physically, and with the full endorsement of the woman who had raised him to believe this was love. I looked at Dolores. She was smiling, genuinely smiling. She believed what she'd just witnessed was good parenting. She believed what her son had just done to my daughter was a correction, not a violation. She believed this because someone had done it to her, and she had survived it by deciding it was normal, and she had passed that decision down like an heirloom. I looked at Rachel. She was straightening her napkin in her lap. Her hands were steady. Her face was composed. She was already rebuilding the surface, already smoothing over the crack, already preparing to serve dessert and clear the plates and say goodnight as though nothing had happened. Because for her, nothing had happened. This was Tuesday. This was the weather. This was just the way the air moved in her house. I heard my own heartbeat. Slow. Clear. Measured. I have sat across interrogation tables from men who killed strangers without remorse. I have studied the behavioral patterns of predators who destroyed lives with the same casual indifference most people reserve for discarding junk mail. I have looked into the eyes of human beings who were capable of extraordinary cruelty, and I have done so without flinching, without raising my voice, without ever once allowing them to see what I was thinking. But I had never, in 28 years, sat across a table from a man who was slowly dismantling my daughter's sense of self, while his mother blessed the process and his child learned to become invisible. I made a decision at that table. Not about what to feel. I already knew what I felt. I made a decision about what to do. And once I made it, I felt something settle inside me, the particular calm that comes when you stop hoping a situation will resolve itself and start building the architecture of its resolution. The rest of dinner was a masterclass in controlled silence. Connor returned to his food as though nothing had happened. He cut his chicken with the same steady hand, chewed with the same measured pace, and resumed talking about the Peachtree Project as though the last 3 minutes had been a commercial break in a program he was ready to continue watching. Dolores followed his lead seamlessly. She asked about timelines and permits and the Nashville investors with the practiced interest of a woman who viewed her son's career the way she viewed her own reflection, as proof that she had done something right. Rachel cleared the plates between courses. She moved around the table with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned that the safest place in a room full of dangerous weather was in motion. Serving, clearing, refilling. She refilled Connor's wine without being asked. She refilled Dolores's water without being thanked. When Maya accidentally set her elbow on the table, Rachel reached over and gently moved it without a word, preemptively correcting a mistake no one else had noticed, because she had been trained to see infractions before they became events. I helped her carry dishes to the kitchen. In the hallway between the dining room and the kitchen, there were photographs on the wall. Maya's school picture from last year, gap-toothed and grinning, a version of my granddaughter that felt like it belonged to a different house. A framed photo of Connor and Dolores at some charity gala. Matching smiles. Matching certainty. And on the far wall, almost hidden behind the doorframe, a small photo of Rachel and Linda at Rachel's law school graduation. My wife's arm around my daughter, both of them laughing. I stopped in front of it for a moment. Linda had been gone for 4 years. Pancreatic cancer. Fast and merciless, and exactly the kind of thing that teaches you that the people you love can be taken from you in ways you cannot prevent. But this, what was happening in this house, this was not cancer. This was a choice. Someone was choosing to do this. And choices, unlike diseases, can be stopped. Rachel brought out dessert. Peach cobbler. She set it on the table with the careful pride of someone presenting something personal, something that mattered beyond the recipe. "This was my mother's recipe," she said. "She used to make it every Thanksgiving and every birthday. It was my favorite thing she made." I looked at the cobbler and I could smell Linda's kitchen. Saturday afternoons in our house in Decatur, flour on the counter. Linda humming something she'd heard on the radio. Rachel standing on a step stool trying to help. The recipe was in Linda's handwriting, in a notebook Rachel had taken after the funeral. It was one of the only things she'd asked for. Dolores looked at the cobbler. She tilted her head the way a person tilts their head at something in a store they've already decided not to buy. "We're not really cobbler people, Rachel." She said it with a small smile, the kind designed to soften a blade without dulling it. "You know that. Peach is a bit heavy for after dinner. Don't you think? I thought it would be nice," Rachel said. "Since Dad's here, it's fine." Connor waved his hand. The same gesture he used for everything Rachel presented. A wave that meant, "I acknowledge this exists, and I've decided it doesn't matter." Rachel sat down. She looked at the cobbler the way you look at something you made with love and then wished you hadn't brought out. The way you look at a piece of yourself you offered to a room that didn't want it. And then Maya spoke. It was barely a whisper. So quiet that if you weren't listening for it, if you weren't trained to hear the things people almost don't say, you would have missed it entirely. But I heard it, and Rachel heard it, and the whole table heard it. Because silence has a way of amplifying the smallest sounds. "I like Mommy's cobbler." 4 words. The first voluntary words Maya had spoken all evening. She said them while looking at her plate, her voice thin and careful, as though she'd weighed each syllable before allowing it out. The table went still. Not the hostile stillness of Connor's silences. A different kind. The kind that happens when something unexpected and unscripted enters a room that has been performing all night. Connor looked at Maya. "Eat your dessert," he said. Not cruelly, just flatly. The way you close a subject you don't intend to reopen. Maya didn't speak again. I served myself a generous portion of the cobbler. I ate it slowly. It tasted exactly like Linda's. Rachel had followed the recipe perfectly, because of course she had. She'd followed it the way you follow a map back to a place you loved, carefully, precisely, hoping that when you arrive, it will still look the way you remember. "It's perfect, sweetheart," I said. "Your mother would be proud." Rachel's eyes filled for just a moment. She blinked it back. She was very good at blinking things back. After dessert, I stood and helped clear the remaining dishes. In the kitchen, Rachel was stacking plates with her back to me. Her shoulders were tight. Her movements were efficient and contained, the choreography of someone who processes emotion through task completion. "Sweetheart, I'm fine, Dad. I didn't say you weren't." She turned around, and for a second her face cracked. Something underneath pushed through. Something raw and exhausted and frightened. And I saw my daughter, the way she actually was. Not the version she performed for this house. Then she pulled it back together, sealed the crack, rebuilt the surface. "He's just under a lot of stress," she said. "The business has been difficult. It's not always like this." "Okay," I said. I didn't argue. I didn't challenge. I filed it. In 28 years of conducting interviews, I'd learned that the worst thing you can do when someone is close to telling you the truth is push them toward it. You wait. You create space. And when they're ready, the truth comes to you on its own. I said my goodbyes at the front door. I hugged Rachel and held on a moment longer than usual. I shook Connor's hand because that was what the moment required. I nodded at Dolores because that was all she deserved. And then Maya was there. She'd appeared at the door without a sound, the way she moved through this house, quietly, carefully, taking up as little space as possible. She looked up at me with Linda's eyes, those deep brown eyes with gold flecks that caught the porch light. And she took my hand. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't say anything. She squeezed my hand. Once. Twice. 2 squeezes. That was all. And then she let go and walked back into the house. And the door closed behind her. I stood on that porch for a long moment. The Buckhead evening was warm and smelled like jasmine from the neighbor's garden. And somewhere down the street, a dog was barking at nothing. And inside that house, my daughter was washing dishes, and my granddaughter was going to bed in a home where silence was the only language that kept her safe. In 28 years of studying human behavior, silence had taught me more than words ever did. I'd listened to the silences of guilty men who thought they were hiding something. I'd listened to the silences of victims who didn't yet know they were allowed to speak. And now I'd listened to the silence of an 8-year-old girl who had found a way to say everything she needed to say without using a single word. 2 squeezes. In the language of a child who had run out of words, it meant one thing. Please, don't leave us here. I walked to my car. I started the engine. And I began. I drove home on Interstate 85 with the radio off and the windows up and the kind of silence that isn't empty. It's the silence of a mind that has stopped deliberating and started planning. By the time I merged onto the Decatur exit, I had already organized what I knew into categories. Observed behaviors, verbal patterns, physical escalation indicators, environmental enablers, a minor child exhibiting signs of trauma-induced behavioral withdrawal. I was thinking in the language I'd used for 28 years. Not because I wanted to, because it was the most precise language I had for what I'd just witnessed. My house on Oakview Road was dark when I pulled in. It had been dark when I came home for 4 years now, ever since Linda died. A 3-bedroom craftsman bungalow with a reading chair by the front window, and a kitchen that was too big for one person, and a backyard garden that Linda had loved, and I hadn't touched since she'd been gone. I told myself I was giving the garden time. The truth was I didn't know how to tend something she'd built without her there to tell me I was doing it wrong. Linda had always been better at growing things than I was. Plants. Friendships. Our daughter. She grew them with instinct. I approached everything like a case file. I sat down at my desk in the study. Oak desk, 20 years old. The surface scarred with decades of legal pads and coffee rings and late-night case reviews. I pulled a fresh legal pad from the drawer, uncapped a pen, and began to write. Subject: Connor David Tate. Age approximately 37. Occupation: owner and principal of Tate Construction, commercial general contractor based in Atlanta, Georgia. I wrote the way I'd written thousands of behavioral assessments during my years at the Bureau. Clean, clinical, precise. Each observation separated from interpretation. Each interpretation supported by behavioral evidence. Behavioral indicators observed during approximately 2.5 hours of direct contact in subject's residence. 1. Verbal dominance pattern. Subject controlled conversational topics. Redirected attention to self repeatedly. Interrupted spouse 3 times without acknowledgement. 2. Dismissive response to spouse's contributions. Subject failed to acknowledge meal preparation, waved hand dismissively at dessert, responded to spouse's educational inquiry for minor child with immediate shutdown. 3. Physical escalation. Subject placed both hands on spouse's shoulders and forcibly seated her during verbal disagreement. Movement was controlled, not impulsive. Indicates practice behavior and prior pattern. 4. Enabling co-participant. Subject's mother, Dolores Tate, verbally endorsed physical intervention, described it as appropriate leadership, and compared it favorably to subject's deceased father's behavior. This suggests intergenerational normalization of intimate partner violence. 5. Minor child impact. Subject's daughter, Maya Tate, age 8, exhibited behavioral indicators consistent with trauma-induced selective mutism, reduced vocalization, hypervigilant posture, avoidance of eye contact with subject, physical rigidity during escalation event. Classification. Type 3. Domestic violence perpetrator profile. Controlled, instrumental aggressor. Uses physical force strategically rather than reactively. Escalation trajectory is predictable and will increase in frequency and severity without intervention. I set the pen down and read what I'd written. 4 pages. In the Bureau, a preliminary behavioral assessment of this quality would have triggered a case review within 48 hours. It would have been assigned a priority level and a case agent and a timeline for investigation. There would have been resources. There would have been a system. Here, in my study in Decatur at 11:15 on a Saturday night, there was no system. There was just me, a 64-year-old retired federal agent with a legal pad and a phone, and 28 years of knowing exactly how situations like this end when no one intervenes. I picked up my phone and called Marcus Dean. Marcus and I had worked together in the Behavioral Analysis Unit for 9 years before he moved to field operations. He'd been my deputy on the Carver case in 2016, a serial domestic abuser in rural Tennessee, whose pattern we'd identified through behavioral analysis before the local police had even classified the incidents as related. Marcus was now the special agent in charge of the FBI's Atlanta field office. He was sharp, methodical, and he owed me nothing, but he picked up on the third ring because that's what people do when someone they trust calls late on a Saturday. Morrow. His voice had the graveled ease of someone who'd been reading in bed. It's been, what, 3 years? About that. I'm sorry for the hour. You don't call at 11:15 to catch up. What's going on? I told him. Not all of it. Enough. I told him about the dinner, about what I'd observed, about Rachel and Maya, about the behavioral profile I'd just completed. I told him I needed guidance. Not a case number. Not yet. He was quiet for a moment. Marcus had always been good at silence. It was one of the reasons he'd been effective in the BAU. He understood that the space between sentences is where the real information lives. You profiled him already, he said. It wasn't a question. Before dessert. What's the classification? Type 3. Controlled instrumental. The mother reinforces. There's a child in the home showing signs of trauma-induced selective mutism. The wife has been in the relationship long enough to fully normalize the behavior. She used the phrase, "he's just stressed," which in my experience is approximately step 7 on a 10-step scale of cognitive adaptation to abuse. What do you need? The name of the best family attorney in Atlanta who won't flinch when she sees what I'm going to put in front of her. And I need you to remember this conversation, Marcus. Date and time. Vanessa Cole, he said without hesitation. She's in Midtown. Former public defender, switched to family law about 6 years ago. She's handled some of the most complex custody cases in Fulton County. She doesn't flinch. He paused. And James. The conversation is remembered. 11:17, Saturday night. I've got it. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I opened my laptop. Tate Construction LLC. Registered in Georgia, 2018. Connor David Tate, Principal and Sole Managing Member. I spent 45 minutes reading everything the public record had to offer. 3 active commercial projects, including a mixed-use development on Peachtree Road and a mid-rise office building in Midtown. 1 civil suit filed by a subcontractor in 2022, settled out of court with terms sealed. 1 OSHA workplace safety complaint filed in 2023, subsequently withdrawn. A second OSHA complaint filed 4 months later, also withdrawn. 2 complaints filed, 2 complaints withdrawn. In my experience, complaints don't withdraw themselves. People withdraw them, usually because someone made it very clear what would happen if they didn't. I wrote it all down on the legal pad. Date, source, filing number, disposition. The same discipline of documentation I'd maintained for nearly 3 decades. Every detail recorded while it was still exact. By midnight, I had 4 pages of behavioral notes, a preliminary profile, a legal pad full of public records, and the name of a family attorney who didn't flinch. I had the beginning of something Connor Tate had never anticipated. Not because he'd underestimated his wife. Not because he'd miscalculated his risk. Because he'd sat across his own dinner table from a man he believed was a retired criminology professor who taught at a small state university and went home to an empty house, and he had never, not for a single moment, considered the possibility that he was wrong about that. He was wrong about that. The next morning I made 3 phone calls. Each one took less than 10 minutes. Each one set something in motion that Connor Tate would not see coming. The first call was to Vanessa Cole. She answered on the second ring with the brisk clarity of someone who had been awake and working for hours. I introduced myself, told her Marcus Dean had given me her name, and asked if she had time to meet. She had an opening at 10. Her office was on Peachtree Street in Midtown, 4th floor of a renovated building with exposed brick and tall windows that let in the kind of light that makes everything look honest. She was younger than I expected, mid-40s, with short natural hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a handshake that told me everything I needed to know about her in 2 seconds. She wasn't performing confidence. She had it. "Marcus speaks very highly of you," she said, gesturing me into a chair across from her desk. "He said you were the best behavioral analyst the Bureau ever produced." I was adequate. She smiled at that. A real smile. The kind that comes from recognizing a particular species of understatement. He also said that when you say adequate, what you mean is exceptional, but pathologically modest. She opened a notebook. "Tell me what's happening," I told her. I laid out the behavioral profile, the observations from the dinner, Rachel's patterns, Maya's silence, the OSHA records, the sealed lawsuit. I spoke for approximately 12 minutes without interruption, because Vanessa Cole was the kind of attorney who understood that the most valuable thing she could do in the first meeting was listen. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. She'd taken 4 pages of notes in handwriting that was small and precise and perfectly legible. The handwriting of someone who had learned that documentation wins cases. "The behavioral assessment is strong," she said. "Unusually strong. I've worked with expert witnesses who couldn't produce something this detailed after 3 sessions, let alone 1 dinner." She looked at me over her glasses. "You understand that your daughter's cooperation is essential for most of what we'd need to do. Protective orders, custody filings, all of it requires her participation." "I understand. And she's not ready yet." "Not yet." Vanessa nodded. "Then we prepare. When she's ready, everything needs to be in place, so she doesn't have to wait. Waiting is where people lose their nerve. Waiting is where the other side regroups." She closed her notebook. "Keep building the documentation. Every observation, every interaction, every text message. And James, be patient with her. The hardest part of leaving isn't the logistics. It's the moment when you stop believing you deserve what's happening to you. That moment comes on its own schedule." "I know," I said. And I did. I'd watched it happen in case after case for nearly 3 decades. The moment of recognition, the moment when the story someone has been telling themselves about their own life stops being convincing. It can't be forced. It can't be scheduled. It can only be prepared for. The second call was to Thomas Birch. Thomas and I had worked together in 2016 on a federal case involving a construction company in Savannah that had been falsifying safety inspections. He'd been with OSHA for 22 years before retiring, and he had the particular tenacity of someone who believed that buildings should not fall on people and that anyone who cut corners with structural integrity deserved whatever consequences found them. "James Morrow," he said when he picked up. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten about the rest of us. I need a favor, Thomas. Professional consultation. Does it involve buildings that might kill someone?" "It might." He went quiet for a second. Thomas had a bloodhound's instinct for structural fraud. "Tell me." I gave him what I had. Tate Construction. 3 active projects. 2 OSHA complaints filed and withdrawn within 18 months. A sealed civil suit with a subcontractor. 2 withdrawn complaints. He repeated slowly. "That's a pattern, not a coincidence. Complaints get filed because someone saw something dangerous enough to risk their job over. They get withdrawn because someone made it clear that the complaint was more dangerous than the hazard." He paused. "I'll pull the public filings and the inspection records. Give me a week. Take whatever time you need. Be thorough, James." His voice shifted slightly. "Is this connected to something personal?" "Yes." "Then I'll be very thorough." I thanked him and ended the call. 2 people in motion. An attorney who didn't flinch, and an investigator who didn't stop. I texted Rachel that afternoon. Simple, undemanding. The kind of message designed to keep a door open without pushing through it. Just checking in. "How are you and Maya doing?" 3 hours later she responded. "Fine. Busy. Maya's doing fine. Thanks for coming to dinner, Dad. It was nice having you there." It was nice having you there." I read that sentence 4 times. In the bureau, we called it minimization language, the verbal technique of reducing a significant experience to something manageable. She wasn't telling me dinner was nice. She was thanking me for witnessing what happened and not making it worse. She was telling me, in the only language she had left, that my presence had mattered. And she was doing it in a text message, because a text message was the only space in her life that Connor couldn't hear. I didn't push. I replied, "Anytime, sweetheart. I'm here whenever you need me." And then I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood at the window and looked at the backyard. Linda's garden. 4 years of neglect had turned it into something unrecognizable. The raised beds she'd built with her own hands were buried under crabgrass and dandelions. The trellis she'd used for her climbing roses had collapsed sideways. The stone path she'd laid one summer weekend, the one Maya used to walk along pretending it was a balance beam, was barely visible beneath the overgrowth. I hadn't tended it since she died. I'd told myself I was waiting for the right time, the right season, the right motivation. But standing there that afternoon, looking at the evidence of 4 years of avoidance, I understood something I hadn't been willing to understand before. I hadn't been waiting for the right time. I'd been afraid that tending Linda's garden without Linda would make her absence feel more permanent than I was ready to accept. Some gardens wait for you to be ready. And some people do too. I turned away from the window and went back to my desk. I picked up the legal pad. I had work to do. 3 calls. 3 people in motion. A family attorney in Midtown who was already preparing a file. An OSHA investigator who was already pulling records. And a retired behavioral analyst in Decatur who was doing what he'd always done. Watching, documenting, and waiting for the moment when watching and documenting would no longer be enough. Somewhere in Buckhead, Connor Tate was going about his evening in the comfortable certainty that his world was exactly as he'd arranged it. His wife was in the kitchen. His daughter was in her room. His mother was a phone call away. And his father-in-law was a retired professor who lived alone in a quiet house and didn't cause problems. He was right about the quiet house. He was right about living alone. He was wrong about everything else. Thomas Birch called me on a Tuesday afternoon, 11 days after that dinner. I was sitting in my reading chair with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, reviewing the notes I'd taken on Tate Construction's public filings for the 3rd time, when the phone rang. I picked up and heard the particular flatness in Thomas's voice that I'd come to recognize over the years, the tone of a man delivering findings he wished he hadn't found. "James, I've got something, and you're going to want to sit down. Except, I'm guessing you're already sitting down because you've probably been sitting at that desk since 6 this morning. Reading chair, actually. And it was 5:30. Of course it was." A brief pause. I pulled inspection records and permit filings for all 3 active Tate construction projects. The Peachtree Road mixed-use development and the residential complex in Decatur both look clean on paper. Standard materials. Standard procedures. Inspections passed within normal parameters. But the third project, the Midtown office building on West Peachtree, that one is a problem. I set my coffee down. "Tell me." "The structural steel specifications in the approved plans call for ASTM, a 992 grade. Standard for commercial construction, load-bearing, reliable. What was actually delivered and installed, based on the procurement records I was able to access through the general contractor filing, was ASTM. A 36. Lower grade. Lower load tolerance. Significantly cheaper." How much cheaper? The substitution saved approximately $340,000 across the full steel package. I've cross-referenced the procurement invoices with the inspection sign-offs, and here's where it gets interesting. The inspection reports list a 992 throughout. Every floor, every beam, every connection point. Someone signed off on steel that wasn't what the plans specified. Either the inspector didn't check, or the inspector was told not to check. I wrote the number on my legal pad. $340,000. I underlined it. "Thomas, what's the occupancy of that building?" "It's an 8-story commercial office building. Current occupancy based on the building management company's website is approximately 400 tenants and employees across 6 active floors. 2 floors are still being fitted out. 400 people. 400 people going to work every morning in a building with substandard structural steel and a set of inspection reports that say everything is fine." Thomas let that sit for a moment. "I've also looked into the 2 withdrawn OSHA complaints. Both were filed by workers at the Midtown site. Both workers were listed under subcontractor payroll through a company called Southeastern Labor Solutions, which appears to be a staffing agency that primarily employs immigrant workers. Were they documented?" One was. One wasn't. The one who wasn't documented filed his complaint in January of last year. It was withdrawn 9 days later. I reached out to a contact at OSHA Region 4 who was willing to speak informally. She told me the withdrawal came with a brief written statement that said the worker had reconsidered and no longer wished to pursue the matter. My contact said the language was unusual. Most voluntary withdrawals are a sentence long and misspelled. This one was 3 paragraphs, grammatically perfect, and read like it was drafted by someone with legal training. Connor wrote it for him, or Connor's attorney did. Either way, the worker withdrew under pressure. My contact said the second complaint, filed 4 months later by a different worker, followed an almost identical pattern, filed, then withdrawn 12 days later with a similarly well-written statement. Thomas paused. "James, I've been doing this for over 2 decades. I've seen corners cut. I've seen inspectors look the other way. But this is something else. He's using undocumented workers because they're cheap and they're afraid. He's paying them roughly a third of standard construction wages, and when they report safety violations, he threatens them with deportation. Not directly, probably. He's too smart for that. But the message gets delivered." I was quiet for a moment. Through the window of my study, I could see the neighbor's magnolia tree, the one Linda used to say bloomed too early every year, optimistic and reckless. I thought about 400 people sitting at desks, drinking coffee, answering phones, having meetings, living their ordinary working lives inside a building that might not be what it appeared to be. I thought about the workers who had tried to say something and been silenced. I thought about the particular cruelty of a man who would risk other people's lives to protect his profit margin, and then go home to a house where he risked his own wife's well-being to protect his pride. Can you document all of this? I asked. Already doing it. I've started a file. Procurement records, inspection cross-references, OSHA complaint timelines, the staffing agency connection. It's preliminary, but it's solid. Give me another 2 weeks, and I'll have something that would hold up in a regulatory proceeding. Take whatever time you need, James. His voice changed, softer now. This is about your daughter, isn't it? It started that way. And now? Now it's about more than that. I looked at my legal pad. The number stared back at me. $340,000. It's about a man who has built his entire life on the assumption that the people around him are too afraid or too powerless to hold him accountable. His wife, his workers, the people in that building. He's been operating on the principle that silence equals consent. And I am very familiar with how that principle works, and with exactly how it ends. Thomas was quiet for a beat. I'll be thorough. I know you will. I ended the call and sat for a while. The afternoon light was shifting through the window at the angle it reaches in early March, that particular light of a season that can't decide whether it's still winter or already something else. I added Thomas's findings to the legal pad. I updated the timeline. I cross-referenced the OSHA withdrawal dates with Tate Construction's project milestones. I'd started this to protect my daughter, to build a case that would give Rachel the foundation she needed to leave safely, with her child, with her dignity, with the legal protections she deserved. That was still the center of everything. That had not changed. But the further I looked into Connor Tate, the wider the damage became. He wasn't just a man who controlled his wife. He was a man who controlled everyone around him through the same mechanism: fear, leverage, and the assumption that no one would ever look closely enough to see what he was doing. His wife was afraid of his temper. His workers were afraid of deportation. His inspectors were afraid of losing contracts. And 400 people in a midtown office building weren't afraid of anything, because they didn't know there was anything to be afraid of. $340,000. That was the price Connor Tate had placed on the structural safety of 400 human beings who trusted that the building they walked into every morning had been built to code, built to hold, built to keep them safe. It was less than Dolores had spent remodeling her living room in Buckhead last spring. A project she'd described at dinner with the satisfied pride of a woman who believed that Italian marble was a personality trait. I added that detail to my notes. Not because it was legally relevant, because it told me something about the moral architecture of a family that valued appearance over integrity, control over care, and money over the lives of people they'd never bothered to consider real. The foundation was cracking. Not just the buildings. Maya's teacher called me on a Thursday afternoon. I was in the kitchen making a sandwich I didn't particularly want. Standing at the counter Linda and I had picked out together 14 years ago, when my phone rang and a name I didn't recognize appeared on the screen. I answered the way I always answer unknown numbers, with the neutral readiness of someone who spent decades expecting calls that changed the direction of an investigation. Mr. Morrow? This is Karen Anderson. I'm Maya's teacher at Brookhaven Academy. Yes, Mrs. Anderson. Rachel has mentioned you. She speaks very highly of your work with the children. Thank you. That means a great deal. She paused, and in that pause, I heard the particular weight of a teacher who has made dozens of these calls and never gotten used to making them. Mr. Morrow, I'm calling because I wanted to speak with someone in Maya's family who I felt would hear me. Rachel gave me your number last month when she updated the emergency contacts. She said if I ever needed to talk to someone, I should call you. Rachel had given her my number. Not Connor's. Mine. I filed that. I'm listening. Maya has stopped speaking at school. She said it plainly, without clinical language, without softening. Not reduced her speech. Not become quieter. Stopped. Entirely. It's been 3 weeks now. She comes to class. She sits down. She does her work. She raises her hand for the restroom. But she does not speak. Not to me. Not to her classmates. Not during recess. Not during lunch. She communicates through nods and written notes when absolutely necessary. But she has not produced a single spoken word in my classroom in 21 days. I closed my eyes. 21 days. I've been teaching second grade for 22 years. Mrs. Anderson continued. I know the difference between a shy child and a child who has lost access to her own voice. Maya is not shy. Maya was one of the most articulate children in this class 4 months ago. She told stories. She asked questions. She raised her hand to answer things before I'd finished asking them. And now she sits in her chair and she watches everything, and she says nothing. And Mr. Morrow, I have seen this before. Not often, but enough to recognize it. What have you observed beyond the silence? Hypervigilance. She monitors the classroom door every time it opens. She flinches at sudden sounds, a book dropping, a chair scraping. She positions herself near exits, and she draws. Mrs. Anderson's voice shifted. She draws constantly, during free time, during transitions, sometimes during instruction when she thinks I'm not watching. I've collected several of her drawings over the past 2 weeks because they concerned me. I'd like to see them. That's why I'm calling. Would you be able to come to the school? I think it's better if you see them in person. I drove to Brookhaven Academy that afternoon. It was a small private school in a converted house on a tree-lined street, the kind of school that smells like construction paper and hand sanitizer, and the particular innocence of a place where children are still supposed to feel safe. Mrs. Anderson met me in the front office. She was in her late 50s, gray-haired, kind-eyed, and she carried a manila folder the way doctors carry test results they haven't yet discussed. We sat in her empty classroom. Small desks, alphabet posters, a reading corner, with a stuffed caterpillar on a beanbag. She opened the folder and placed the drawings on the desk between us, one at a time, the way you lay out evidence. Most of them were what you'd expect from an 8-year-old. A house, a dog she wished she had, a tree with a swing. They were detailed and careful, and showed a child with a strong visual mind. And then she placed the last drawing in front of me. It was a family. 4 figures standing in front of a house. The house was large, carefully drawn, recognizably the Buckhead Colonial, with its columns and wide front steps. The 4 figures were not drawn to scale, not in the way children's drawings are usually out of proportion, with heads too big and arms too long. These proportions were deliberate. The father figure was enormous. He filled nearly half the page. His body was wide, his arms thick, his head almost touching the roof of the house. He stood in the center of the drawing with his feet planted wide apart and his hands at his sides, taking up as much space as possible. His face had no smile. His eyes were 2 dark circles, fixed forward, watchful. The mother was small, remarkably small. She was drawn in the lower left corner of the page, almost behind the house, as though she were trying to stand somewhere she wouldn't be noticed. Her body was thin, her arms pressed against her sides, her head slightly bowed. She took up less space on the page than the front door of the house. The child, Maya herself, was drawn behind the 4th figure. She was partially hidden, peeking out from behind the legs of a tall man with gray at his temples and kind eyes, and both arms stretched wide, as though he were standing between her and something she couldn't see. The tall man was me, and she'd drawn me the way a child draws the thing they believe will keep them safe. Arms open, body turned outward, standing between her and the enormous figure on the other side of the page. I looked at that drawing for a long time. In 28 years at the Bureau, I had examined crime scene photographs that documented the worst things human beings are capable of doing to each other. I had studied autopsy reports and surveillance footage and interrogation transcripts that would give most people nightmares. I had trained myself to process that material with professional detachment, to see it as data, as evidence, as pieces of a puzzle that needed solving rather than images that needed to be felt. My granddaughter's crayon drawing nearly broke me. I excused myself and walked into the hallway. I stood there for perhaps a minute, my hand against the wall, and I let it move through me. The grief and the rage and the helplessness and the love. All of it, the whole tangled weight of being a grandfather who understood exactly what that drawing meant and could not yet do anything to change the world it depicted. I let it come and I let it pass, and then I straightened my shoulders and walked back into the classroom. Mrs. Anderson, I need to ask you to document your observations formally. Dates, behaviors, the drawings. I need you to file a concern with the school counselor through whatever official process your school uses. She nodded. I've already started. I filed an initial concern with our counselor last week. We take these things very seriously here. I know you do. That's why I'm trusting you with this. She looked at me with the steady gaze of a woman who had spent 22 years watching children and had learned to read the adults who came to collect them. Mr. Morrow, may I ask you something? Of course. Are you going to help her? Yes, I said, I am. She gave me a photocopy of the drawing. I drove home and placed it on my desk next to the legal pad. 2 documents side by side. One was a 4-page behavioral assessment compiled by a man who had spent nearly 3 decades in the FBI's most specialized investigative unit, written in precise clinical language with referenced observations and a professional classification framework. The other was drawn in crayon on construction paper by an 8-year-old girl who had run out of words. I sat in my reading chair that night and studied that drawing, the way I'd once studied crime scenes. Every detail, every proportion, every choice. A mother made small, a father made enormous, a grandfather with his arms stretched wide, and a little girl hiding behind the only person she believed could stand between her and the thing that had stolen her voice. Maya had stopped talking, but she had found another way to tell the truth. And the truth, whether it comes in a federal report or a crayon drawing, always looks the same. It looks like someone asking to be seen. The call I wasn't expecting came on a Saturday morning. I was in the kitchen making coffee when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. A Georgia area code, but not Atlanta. Mr. Morrow? A man's voice, careful and deliberate, with the cadence of someone speaking in a language that wasn't his first, but that he'd worked hard to master. Each word was placed precisely, the way bricks are placed by someone who understands that what you build depends entirely on the care you take with each piece. Speaking. My name is Miguel Reyes. Thomas Birch gave me your number. He said you would understand why I'm calling. A pause. I worked for Tate Construction for 3 years. I was a structural welder on the Midtown office building. I saw things that I reported, and I was told that if I continued to report them, there would be consequences for my family. I am calling because I have decided that the consequences of staying silent are worse than the consequences of speaking. There was a steadiness in his voice that I recognized. It was the steadiness of someone who has been afraid for a long time and has finally reached the point where the fear of doing nothing has overtaken the fear of doing something. I'd heard that voice in interview rooms, in the quiet moments before testimony. It is the voice of courage, and it sounds nothing like what people think courage sounds like. It doesn't roar. It shakes, and then it speaks anyway. We met that afternoon at a small cafe in Clarkston, a neighborhood 20 minutes east of Atlanta, with one of the most diverse immigrant communities in the Southeast. The cafe was called La Esperanza and served Guatemalan coffee and tamales. Miguel Reyes was already seated when I arrived. He was about 40, compact and strong in the way that men who work with their hands are strong, with calloused fingers and careful eyes, and a posture that suggested he was used to taking up less space than he deserved. He shook my hand. We ordered coffee, and then he told me. He told me about the steel. He'd known it was wrong the first week. I've been welding structural steel for 16 years. In Guatemala, then Texas, then here. You learn to feel the difference. Essex autre dieu is softer. It behaves differently under the arc. I told my foreman the first day. He said the specs had been updated, and to do my job. He told me about the inspections. The inspector came once a month. He would walk through with Mr. Tate like friends, never checked the steel markings, signed the forms on the hood of his truck, and drove away. He told me about the workers, There were 12 of us on that crew. 8 were undocumented, hired through a staffing company that paid cash. No benefits. When Carlos Mejia fell from the 4th floor and broke his wrist, they drove him to a clinic and told him if he filed a workers' compensation claim, they would call immigration. Carlos has 3 children. He didn't file. He told me about the complaints. I filed one myself in January of last year. 9 days later, a man came to my apartment. He said that Mr. Tate was aware of my complaint, and that if I didn't withdraw it, someone would make sure that my cousin Eduardo, who was waiting for his asylum hearing, would be flagged for removal. Miguel's coffee was untouched. I withdrew. I wrote what they told me to write. 3 paragraphs dictated over the phone. Then I quit. A second worker filed 4 months later. Same thing happened. Do you have documentation? Photographs. Anything physical? He pulled out his phone. Older model, cracked screen, the kind that has survived job sites and grocery runs and school pickups. He opened the photo gallery and turned it toward me. Dozens of photographs, steel beams with visible grade markings, connection points with missing bolts, concrete pours with visible voids, welds ground down to hide cracks rather than repaired. Each photograph dated, each geotagged to the Midtown site. I took these over 8 months, Miguel said. I knew that someday someone would need to see them. I am a welder, Mr. Morrow. My job is to make connections that hold. When I see connections that won't hold, I photograph them. I looked through them slowly. Unedited, unaltered. The straightforward documentation of a man who understood what he was seeing and wanted someone else to understand it too. Why now? I asked. You quit over a year ago. Miguel set down his phone. He looked past me toward the window, where the afternoon light was falling on the cafe floor in a warm rectangle. When he looked back, something deeper was in his expression. Something personal. My daughter, Sophia, is 10 years old. She goes to Clarkston Elementary. The gymnasium at Clarkston Elementary was built by Tate Construction 2 years ago. He let that settle. Every morning I drive her to school. I watch her walk through the front door, and every morning I look at the walls of that building and I think about what I know. About the steel. About the inspections. About what Mr. Tate considers acceptable risk. He picked up his coffee for the first time. His hand was steady. I can live with many things. I lived with silence for over a year. But I cannot live with dropping my daughter off at a building every morning and wondering if today is the day I should have said something. I looked at this man across the table. This welder from Guatemala, who had built structures with his hands for 16 years and understood at a molecular level what it meant for a connection to hold or to fail. And I recognized something in him. Not from the bureau. Not from case files. I recognized it because I'd seen it in my own mirror for the past 3 weeks. A father who had reached the end of what he could tolerate in silence. I gave him Vanessa Cole's number and Thomas Birch's number. He nodded at each name, memorizing, the discipline of a man who had survived by paying attention. We shook hands in the parking lot. The afternoon sun was warm, and somewhere inside the cafe, someone had turned on a radio playing something slow in Spanish, the kind of music that sounds like endurance. I drove home through Clarkston and Decatur, past the schools and office buildings and the houses where families were having their Saturday afternoons, and I thought about what Miguel Reyes and I had in common. Different countries, different languages, different careers, different lives in almost every measurable way. And yet we'd sat across a cafe table united by the simplest arithmetic in the world. Our daughter's safety was not negotiable. Not for any threat. Not for any price. Not for any silence. Miguel Reyes had risked everything to protect his daughter from a building. I was doing the same thing. Protecting mine from the man who built it. Rachel called on a Wednesday night. She was crying before she said a word. Not the kind of crying that announces itself. Not the kind that rises and peaks and demands attention. The kind that's been held underwater for so long its surface is gasping, breath-catching, breath-releasing. The sound of someone who has run out of places inside themselves to store what they've been carrying. Dad, I'm here. I can't. She stopped. Started again. Maya hasn't spoken at school in 4 weeks. 4 weeks. Mrs. Anderson called me this afternoon, and I had to sit in the school parking lot afterward and pretend I wasn't falling apart. I sat in my car for 40 minutes because I couldn't drive. I couldn't see the road. I closed my eyes. 4 weeks. The 3 weeks Mrs. Anderson had told me about had become 4. The silence was growing. And yesterday, Rachel's voice broke apart on the word. Yesterday. She looked at me. We were in the kitchen. Just the two of us. And she looked up at me and she said, "Mommy, why do you always say sorry, even when you didn't do anything wrong?" She made a sound. Not quite a sob. Something deeper. The sound of a wall that has been holding for years, finally giving way. She's 8, Dad. 8 years old. And she sees it. She sees what I've been telling myself isn't there. She watches me apologize for existing in my own house. And she's old enough to know that something is wrong with that, and I have been so busy surviving that I didn't realize my daughter was watching me teach her how to disappear. I sat in my reading chair, and I held the phone. And I did what I had done in thousands of interviews, with thousands of people who were finding their way to the truth. I stayed quiet. I gave her the space. "Where are you right now?" I asked. "In my car. In the Kroger parking lot on Peachtree Road. He doesn't know I left. He's watching something. I told him I needed milk. Can you come here?" A pause. Long enough to hear her breathing slow. Long enough to hear the decision being made. "He'll want to know where I went. Tell him you needed air and stop by to see your father." I kept my voice steady. Warm but not urgent. A door, not a push. Or don't tell him anything. You're an adult, Rachel. You're allowed to visit your father on a Wednesday night. She came. 25 minutes later, her headlights pulled into my driveway on Oakview Road. I had the coffee on. I had the kitchen light on. I had the door unlocked. The small preparations of a man who had been waiting for this moment for weeks and had promised himself he would not waste it by being unprepared. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd done her homework as a girl, where Linda had helped her with college applications, where we'd eaten 10,000 meals as a family of 3. She wrapped both hands around the coffee mug and held it the way you hold something when you need your hands to stop shaking. I sat across from her and I waited. She talked for 2 hours. Not continuously. In waves. The way water comes in when a dam breaks, surging, and then subsiding, and then surging again. She told me things she hadn't told anyone. She told me Connor had started controlling the money 6 months ago. Her name was still on the joint account, but he'd moved the majority of their savings into a separate account she couldn't access. He told her it was for tax purposes. She'd known it wasn't, but hadn't challenged it. She told me he'd started checking her phone. Not secretly. Openly. He'd pick it up from the counter, scroll through her messages, and set it back down without a word. The point wasn't what he found. The point was that she knew he was looking. She told me Dolores called every Sunday evening. Not to chat. To instruct. She tells me what Connor needs from me that week. What dinners to make. What events to attend. When to have the house ready for her visits. She calls it helping. It's not helping. She told me that 3 weeks ago, Connor had taken her car keys and put them in his office drawer. He said it was because the car needed maintenance. The car was fine. She'd been asking friends for rides to the grocery store and telling them she was between cars. She told me about the silence. Not Maya's silence. Her own. How it had grown over the years the way ivy grows over a wall, slowly and then completely, until the wall itself is no longer visible beneath it. How she'd stopped calling friends, stopped texting me anything real, stopped saying what she thought at dinner, at church, in bed, anywhere Connor might hear an opinion he hadn't authorized. "I used to argue Supreme Court cases with you at this table," she said quietly. looking at the kitchen surface as though she could see the ghost of the girl she'd been. I used to have opinions about everything. When did I stop having opinions? You didn't stop having them, I said. You stopped being allowed to express them. Those are very different things. She looked at me. Her eyes were red and exhausted, and more honest than I'd seen them in years. I don't even know where to start, Dad. I don't have money. I don't have a lawyer. I don't have proof of anything except a feeling that I'm losing myself and a daughter who won't speak, and a husband who has convinced me for years that everything wrong in our house is something I caused. She set down the mug. I don't know where to start. I looked at my daughter across the kitchen table. The girl who had graduated magna cum laude from Emory Law. The woman who had spent 2 years fighting for refugee rights before a man convinced her she was needed more at home. The mother whose 8-year-old daughter had drawn her the smallest figure on a page. I set down my coffee cup. You don't have to start, I said. I already did. Rachel stared at me across the kitchen table. The coffee was cooling between us. The house was quiet, the way only an empty house at night can be quiet. The refrigerator humming. The clock on the wall marking seconds that felt heavier than they should. What do you mean? You already did. I folded my hands on the table. The same gesture I'd used in 1,000 briefings. In 1,000 meetings where the information I was about to deliver was going to change the shape of the conversation permanently. I spoke carefully, not because I was uncertain, but because what I was about to tell my daughter was going to rearrange her understanding of the last several weeks, and I wanted her to be able to hold each piece before I handed her the next. The night of that dinner, I said, I drove home and wrote a complete behavioral assessment of your husband. 4 pages. Clinical, detailed, documented with timestamps and direct observations. I then made a phone call to a former colleague who connected me with Vanessa Cole. She's a family attorney in Midtown, one of the best in Fulton County. She's reviewed my documentation and she's agreed to represent you on a preliminary basis. No retainer. When you're ready, she's ready. Rachel's lips parted slightly. She didn't speak. I also contacted Thomas Birch, a retired OSHA investigator I've worked with before. He spent the last 3 weeks examining Tate Construction's public records. He's found that the Midtown office building your husband is constructing used substandard structural steel, saving approximately $340,000 while putting 400 people at risk. The inspection reports were falsified. 2 OSHA safety complaints were filed by workers and withdrawn under pressure. Thomas has documented everything. Rachel's hand had moved to her mouth. She was shaking her head slowly, not in denial. In disbelief. Last Saturday, I met with a man named Miguel Reyes. He's a former structural welder who worked for Connor's company for 3 years. He was one of the workers who filed an OSHA complaint and was coerced into withdrawing it. He has photographs from the construction site, dozens of them, showing the substandard materials and the falsified inspections. He's spoken with Vanessa and with Thomas. He's prepared to provide a sworn statement. I reached into the folder on the counter behind me and placed a single sheet of paper on the table between us. The photocopy of Maya's drawing. The enormous father. The tiny mother. The little girl hiding behind her grandfather. Maya's teacher, Mrs. Anderson, called me 2 weeks ago. Maya hasn't spoken at school in 4 weeks. Mrs. Anderson has filed formal documentation with the school counselor. She gave me this. I paused. Your daughter can't speak, Rachel. But she drew this. She drew you small. She drew him enormous. And she drew herself hiding behind me. Rachel looked at the drawing. Her face changed the way a landscape changes when clouds break. Everything shifting at once. Light reaching places that had been dark for a long time. She touched the paper with her fingertips, tracing the tiny figure in the corner. Her own image, rendered in crayon by her daughter. The smallest person on the page. How? She whispered. How did you do all of this? Do you remember what I told you when you were 12 and that boy at school was copying your homework? You came to me at this table, right here, and you asked me what to do. She almost smiled. Almost. Document everything. Document everything. Then use the right channel. I paused. That's all I've done. Except this time the channel was a bit more extensive than the school principal. Rachel wiped her eyes. Connor thinks you're a retired criminology professor. He told his mother you taught at Georgia State. He actually used the word harmless once. He said you were harmless. I took a sip of my coffee. It had gone cold, but I drank it anyway. Some moments require you to be unhurried. Rachel, I spent 28 years in the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. I was the chief of a team that specialized in profiling violent offenders. I sat across interrogation tables from serial killers and told them what they were going to do next before they did it. I've profiled over 400 violent offenders. I've testified in federal court 61 times, and not once has my testimony been successfully challenged. I set down the cup. Your husband sat across from me at his dinner table and looked me in the eye and saw a quiet, retired old man with a government pension who doesn't push back. A man who sits politely and says nothing and goes home to an empty house. I held her gaze. That is exactly what I wanted him to see. Rachel stared at me. The kitchen clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed on Oakview Road, its headlights sweeping briefly across the window and then disappearing. My God, Dad. He doesn't just not know who I am, Rachel. He doesn't know what he's facing. And by the time he finds out, it will already be over. The documentation is built. The attorney is prepared. The witnesses are in place. The financial records, the construction fraud, the OSHA violations, all of it is assembled and ready to move the moment you say the word. I reached across the table and covered her hands with mine. You have never been alone in this. Not for one single day. I have been 3 miles away this entire time. And I have been working every day since that dinner to make sure that when you were ready, everything would already be in place. You don't have to build anything. You don't have to find anyone. You don't have to figure out where to start. All you have to do is say yes. Rachel put her face in her hands. Not from despair. I knew the difference. I had seen despair in that kitchen years ago when Linda was diagnosed. This was not despair. This was the sound of someone setting down a weight they had been carrying alone for so long that they had forgotten it was possible to put it down. This was relief. This was the structural collapse of the lie she'd been telling herself. That she had to do this by herself. That no one was coming. That the only option was endurance. Someone had come. Someone had been there the whole time. She cried for a while and I let her. I didn't rush it. Some things need their full duration. She left just after midnight. At the front door, she turned and looked at me the way she used to look at me when she was very young, and the world felt too large and too complicated. And the only thing that made it manageable was knowing that her father was in the next room. She took my hand, and she squeezed it. Once. Twice. 2 squeezes. The same language Maya had spoken at the front door in Buckhead 6 weeks earlier. The same silent code passed from daughter to mother, or maybe from mother to daughter. Or maybe it had always belonged to both of them. This small gesture that meant everything words couldn't carry. I watched her taillights disappear down Oakview Road. And I knew. The way I had known 1,000 times, in 1,000 interrogation rooms, when the moment arrives and the truth finally steps forward, that she was ready. Rachel filed for divorce on a Monday morning. 3 weeks after she sat at my kitchen table and learned she wasn't alone. 3 weeks of preparation, of meetings with Vanessa Cole, of signing documents and reviewing evidence and making the kind of decisions that rearrange the architecture of a life. She told me later that the morning she signed the papers, she sat in her car outside Vanessa's office for 10 minutes before going in. Not because she was uncertain, because she wanted to remember what it felt like to choose something for herself. Connor was served at his office at Tate Construction at 11:15 that same morning. A process server walked into the lobby, asked for Connor David Tate, and handed him a manila envelope containing the divorce petition, the motion for temporary custody, and the request for a temporary order of protection. By Tuesday afternoon, Vanessa had filed the full protection order petition with the Fulton County Superior Court. The supporting documentation was extensive. My behavioral assessment, formatted and annotated with the precision of someone who had submitted expert testimony to federal courts 61 times. Mrs. Anderson's formal report documenting Maya's selective mutism, including the timeline of behavioral changes and the school counselor's clinical observations. The photocopy of Maya's drawing entered as Exhibit C. And something Rachel had given Vanessa during their second meeting. Something she hadn't told me about until it was already in the file. Photographs. 3 of them, taken on her phone, of a bruise on her left forearm from 2 months earlier. She'd photographed it the morning after it happened, standing in the bathroom with the door locked while Connor was at work. She hadn't known why she was taking the pictures at the time. She told Vanessa she'd done it on instinct. The instinct of someone who had learned, somewhere deep below the surface of her daily compliance, that documentation might matter someday. I didn't know about those photographs until Vanessa mentioned them in a phone call that Wednesday. I hung up and sat for a long time in my reading chair. My daughter had been documenting her own evidence while I was documenting mine. She'd been building her own small, secret record in the only space she had left. A locked bathroom, a phone camera, a few seconds of stolen privacy. She'd learned it from me. Document everything. Use the right channel. She just hadn't known yet that the channel existed. Connor responded the way I expected him to respond. He hired Martin Kessler. Kessler was a divorce attorney in Buckhead with a reputation for aggressive counter-litigation. He was the kind of lawyer other lawyers described using words like effective and relentless, which in my experience were polite synonyms for someone willing to win by making the process as painful as possible for the other side. He charged $600 an hour, and he'd never lost a custody case. A fact his website mentioned 3 times. Vanessa had faced him before. She called me the evening after Kessler filed his initial response. He's going to argue that the abuse claims are fabricated, she said. That this is a strategic maneuver to gain advantage in the custody dispute. Standard aggressive playbook. He'll attack credibility first, then try to reframe the narrative. What does our evidence look like? Strong. Very strong. 2 independent documentation sources, yours and the school's, corroborating physical evidence, a minor child's behavioral record, and a behavioral assessment that any judge in this state will take seriously. She paused. He asked Connor about you during their initial strategy session. Connor told him you were a retired professor from Georgia State who taught criminal justice. What did Kessler say? He said he'd look into it. Another pause. James, when Kessler looks into it, he's going to find out who you are. And when he does, the dynamic of this case is going to shift. I'm counting on it. Dolores launched her campaign the same week the papers were filed. She moved with the organized efficiency of a woman who had spent decades managing social narratives within her community. She called the pastor of their church, First Baptist of Buckhead, and requested a meeting. She called 3 women from the church auxiliary who had known Rachel socially. She called the mother of one of Maya's classmates. To each of them, she delivered the same carefully constructed message. Rachel was unstable. Rachel had been struggling with mental health issues. James, the father, was a bitter, manipulative old man who had never approved of the marriage and had poisoned his daughter against a good, hard-working, God-fearing husband. The divorce was an act of betrayal. The abuse allegations were lies designed to steal a man's child and destroy his reputation. Dolores delivered this narrative with the same calm authority she brought to everything. She used words like prayer and concern and heartbroken. She framed her campaign as compassion. She framed her lies as love. For about a week, some people listened. In small communities, the first story told is often the story believed, because it arrives before the audience has developed the skepticism to question it. A few women from the church auxiliary sent Rachel messages expressing concern in language that was clearly influenced by Dolores's version of events. One of them used the phrase both sides in a way that made it clear she'd already chosen one. Rachel showed me the messages. She was shaken, but not broken. There's a difference, and it matters. Shaken means the foundation holds. Broken means it doesn't. She's telling everyone I'm crazy, Rachel said. She's telling everyone a story, I said. Stories only work when there isn't a better one. And there will be. I was right about that. But the better story didn't come from me, or from Vanessa, or from any attorney's filing. It came from somewhere none of us had planned. And it came fast. But first, Martin Kessler made a phone call. Martin Kessler was, by all accounts, a thorough attorney. He charged $600 an hour, in part because he never walked into a courtroom without knowing more about the opposing party than they knew about themselves. It was his standard practice. Background checks, financial profiles, professional histories. He built files the way engineers build bridges, one structural element at a time, so that when the weight of a case pressed down, nothing gave. It took him less than 48 hours to find what Connor had never thought to look for. The call came on a Wednesday evening. I know this because Vanessa told me about it afterward. Having learned the details from Kessler's own paralegal during a professional exchange that both sides would later characterize as routine, Kessler called Connor at 7:15 in the evening. Connor was at home, in the Buckhead house that was now the subject of a property dispute. Sitting in the study that Rachel had never been allowed to use. Your father-in-law, Kessler said. The retired professor. From Georgia State. What about him? He's not a professor. A pause that Kessler, to his credit, did not fill with qualifications or softening language. He simply stated the facts. James Allen Morrow, 28 years with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Behavioral Analysis Unit, Quantico, Virginia. He served as unit chief for the last 6 years of his career. He is one of the most cited criminal profilers in the Bureau's published case literature. He has testified as an expert witness in federal court 61 times. His conviction rate on cases where he provided behavioral analysis is 94%. The line was quiet for what Kessler's paralegal later described as an unusually long time. He retired 3 years ago, Kessler continued. He lives in Decatur. He has no social media presence, no public profile, and no apparent interest in being recognized, which is probably why you didn't know. Another pause. Why didn't you tell me who he was? I didn't know, Connor said, and there it was. 3 words. The same 3 words, more or less, that Connor Tate had spent years making sure other people said about themselves. I didn't know. I didn't know he was doing that. I didn't know it was wrong. I didn't know there were options. He'd built his entire domestic architecture on the principle that the people around him wouldn't know, couldn't know, shouldn't know, and now, for the first time, those words belonged to him. Vanessa told me that Kessler's tone shifted after that. Not dramatically. Kessler was a professional, but there was a recalibration. The slight adjustment of a man who had walked into a case believing he held the stronger hand, and was now realizing that the cards had been dealt differently than his client had described. This changes the evidentiary landscape, Kessler said. His behavioral assessment isn't a concerned father's opinion. It's an expert evaluation from one of the top criminal profilers in the country. Any judge in Fulton County is going to give that significant weight. Can you discredit it? On what grounds? His methodology is published. His testimony record is clean. There's no angle of attack that doesn't make us look like we're trying to suppress expert evidence. Kessler paused. Connor, I need you to be very honest with me from this point forward. Is there anything else about this situation that you haven't told me? I don't know what Connor said to that. I don't need to know. What I know is that for the first time since I'd met him, the man who had spent years making my daughter feel small was experiencing what it felt like when the room you thought you controlled turns out to have walls you didn't build and doors you can't lock. The second shift happened 72 hours later, and it came from Miguel Reyes. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution published a piece on a Thursday morning. The headline read, "Former worker alleges safety violations at Midtown construction site." The article was 1,200 words. It did not mention the divorce. It did not mention Rachel or Maya or me. It was, on its surface, a straightforward investigative piece about workplace safety concerns at a commercial construction project on West Peachtree Street. Miguel had spoken to a reporter. He'd done so on his own, without consulting me, without Vanessa's involvement. As a private citizen exercising his right to speak about conditions he'd witnessed. He'd provided photographs. He'd provided dates. He'd provided his name, which took a kind of courage that most people will never be asked to demonstrate. The article described substandard steel. It described withdrawn OSHA complaints. It described workers who were afraid to speak because of their immigration status. It quoted an unnamed structural engineer who reviewed the photographs and described the steel substitution as presenting significant risk to occupant safety under certain load conditions. The article went up at 6 in the morning. By noon, it had been shared 4,000 times. By evening, 2 local television stations had picked up the story. By the following Monday, the Fulton County Building Inspector's Office had announced a formal review of Tate Construction's active permits. Dolores's church campaign, which had been gaining quiet traction among the women of First Baptist, collapsed within days. Not because anyone confronted Dolores directly, because when the people she'd been calling typed Connor Tate into a search engine, the first result was no longer his company website. It was the AJC article, and suddenly the story Dolores had been telling. The story of a good man victimized by an unstable wife and a meddling father required its audience to ignore a rather large and public counter-narrative. One by one, the calls stopped. The sympathetic messages to Rachel dried up. 2 women from the church auxiliary sent Rachel a second round of messages, this time with a noticeably different tone. "We're so sorry. We didn't know the full picture. We're praying for you and Maya." Dolores did not call anyone to correct the record. Dolores went quiet. In my experience, people like Dolores go quiet not when they've changed their minds, but when they've run out of audience. In the space of 72 hours, Connor Tate went from a man who believed he controlled the narrative of his own life to a man discovering, piece by piece, that the narrative had been rewritten without his permission. His attorney was recalculating. His mother was retreating. His business was under public scrutiny. And the quiet, harmless, retired professor at the end of his dinner table had turned out to be something he never imagined. Somewhere in Buckhead, in a house he would soon no longer own, a man who had spent years making other people feel small was learning, for the first time, what it felt like to shrink. The preliminary hearing for the order of protection was set for a Thursday morning in May. I wore the same suit I'd worn on my last day at the bureau, a navy 2-button that Linda had picked out for me 11 years ago at a department store in Tysons Corner, Virginia. She'd held it up against me in the mirror and said, "This is the suit that says I've already won, and I'm just here to collect." I'd worn it to my retirement ceremony. I'd worn it to her funeral. And now I wore it to a courtroom in Fulton County, where my daughter's safety was going to be decided by a woman in a black robe who had never met any of us before today. It still fit. Some things hold their shape. Through everything. The Fulton County Superior Court building is on Pryor Street in downtown Atlanta. A modern structure with high ceilings and long corridors that smell like floor polish and institutional neutrality. I arrived 40 minutes early because I have always arrived early to courtrooms. In 28 years of testifying, I'd learned that the first person in a courtroom sets the temperature of the room. I wanted the temperature calm. Rachel was already there with Vanessa. She was wearing a gray dress that I hadn't seen before, simple and appropriate, and she was sitting very straight in a chair outside the courtroom with her hands folded in her lap. When she saw me, she stood and hugged me briefly, tightly, and then sat back down. She didn't need words from me at that moment. She needed my presence. There's a difference. And I'd spent a career learning it. Connor arrived with Kessler at 9:52. He was wearing a suit that cost more than mine, and a tie that had been selected to convey exactly the right amount of respectability. He looked thinner than he had at the dinner, not the thinness of someone who isn't eating, the thinness of someone who is being consumed by something they can't control. He glanced in my direction as he passed. I met his eyes without expression. He looked away first. Dolores was not in the gallery. I noted that. Judge Tamara Williams entered at 10 o'clock sharp. She was a woman in her mid-50s with short silver hair and reading glasses on a chain, and the particular stillness of a judge who has spent years listening to people lie and has developed the patience to wait for the truth to surface on its own. She reviewed the docket, confirmed the parties, and invited Vanessa to present. Vanessa was precise. She presented the evidence in the order she and I had discussed, building from foundation to structure the way you build a case that needs to hold weight. First, my behavioral assessment. She introduced it not as a father's opinion, but as an expert evaluation prepared by a 28-year veteran of the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit who had been present during the incident in question and had directly observed the respondent's behavior. Kessler objected to the characterization of the assessment as expert testimony. Judge Williams looked at him over her reading glasses. The author's credentials are in the filing. Counselor, I'll determine the weight. Continue. Second, Mrs. Anderson's formal documentation. 4 weeks of recorded observations. The timeline of Maya's behavioral withdrawal. The school counselor's clinical notes describing symptoms consistent with trauma-induced selective mutism in a minor child. Third, the medical evidence. Rachel's photographs of the bruise on her forearm, dated and time-stamped by her phone's metadata. Vanessa presented them without embellishment. The photographs spoke their own language. Fourth, Maya's drawing. Vanessa placed the photocopy on the evidence table and let Judge Williams look at it for a long moment. The enormous father, the tiny mother, the child hiding behind her grandfather. No one in that courtroom needed an explanation of what they were seeing. The drawing explained itself the way all truth does. Simply, and without negotiation. Fifth, Miguel Reyes's sworn statement documenting workplace intimidation and the coerced withdrawal of OSHA safety complaints entered to establish a pattern of controlling and threatening behavior extending beyond the domestic relationship. When Vanessa finished, the courtroom was quiet. The particular quiet that follows a presentation so thorough that the air itself seems to be holding its breath. Kessler stood. He adjusted his tie. He spoke with the measured confidence of a man who had been paid a great deal of money to make the best argument available, even when the best available argument was not very good. Your Honor, the respondent respectfully submits that a temporary order of protection is unnecessary at this time. The parties are cooperating with the divorce process. Mr. Tate has voluntarily vacated the marital residence. He poses no immediate threat to the petitioner or the minor child, and the allegations in the petition are contested. We believe the court can trust both parties to conduct themselves appropriately throughout the proceedings. Judge Williams looked at him. She did not remove her reading glasses. She did not lean forward. She simply looked at him with the steady, unhurried gaze of a woman who had heard every version of that argument and had never once found it persuasive. Counselor, she said, I have before me an expert behavioral assessment from a 28-year FBI veteran who was personally present during an incident of physical aggression. I have school documentation spanning 4 weeks, recording trauma-induced selective mutism in a minor child. I have time-stamped photographic evidence of physical injury. I have a drawing, made by an 8-year-old girl, in which she depicted her mother as the smallest figure on the page and herself hiding behind her grandfather. She paused. Your counter-evidence is your client's word, that he poses no threat. What specifically would you like me to weigh against this record? Kessler opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Your Honor, we would note that the behavioral assessment was prepared by a family member, not an independent. A family member with 28 years of federal investigative experience and 61 instances of accepted expert testimony. Judge Williams said, I've reviewed his curriculum vitae. It's in the filing. She looked at Kessler over her glasses one more time. Is there anything else? No, Your Honor. Order of protection granted. The respondent shall maintain a distance of no less than 500 feet from the petitioner and the minor child. Contact shall occur only through counsel. Visitation with the minor child shall be supervised pending the full hearing. She closed the folder. We're adjourned. I walked out of that courtroom into May sunshine. The air was warm and smelled like the particular sweetness of Atlanta in spring, magnolias and car exhaust, and the faint mineral scent of rain that hadn't arrived yet. I called Rachel, who was standing with Vanessa at the end of the corridor. "It's done," I said. "Order granted." I heard her exhale. A long, shaking breath that carried the weight of months. "How are you so calm right now?" she asked. "I've been in rooms like that for 40 years, sweetheart. I know what the beginning of the end looks like." I watched the sunlight fall across the courthouse steps. "It looks like this." The divorce trial took 6 weeks to complete. 6 weeks of depositions and motions and counter-motions and the slow, grinding procedural machinery that turns a marriage into a legal matter and a legal matter into a verdict. I attended every session. I sat in the gallery in the same seat, 3rd row, left side, the way I'd sat in courtrooms for decades. Consistent presence is its own form of testimony. The judge sees you, the opposing counsel sees you, and the person you're there for knows, every single day, that they are not sitting in that room alone. I testified once, during the custody portion. Vanessa called me to the stand on a Tuesday morning. I walked to the witness box, took the oath, and sat down with the particular calm of someone who has done this 61 times before and understands that the witness stand is not a place for emotion. It is a place for precision. Vanessa's questions were direct. She asked me to describe what I had observed during the dinner. I described it. She asked me to explain the basis for my behavioral assessment. I explained it. She asked me to clarify my professional qualifications. I clarified them. I spoke the way I had always spoken under oath, in complete sentences, without hedging, without speculation, with the exact specificity that comes from decades of knowing that every word you say in a courtroom is being recorded and weighed. Kessler stood for cross-examination. He buttoned his jacket. He approached the podium with the measured stride of a man who had spent the last 6 weeks looking for a weakness in my testimony and was about to demonstrate that he hadn't found one by trying anyway. "Mr. Morrow," he said, with the carefully neutral tone of someone constructing a trap and hoping it looks like a question, "you made several phone calls in the days following that dinner. You contacted an attorney, a former OSHA investigator, and a former colleague at the FBI. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And all of these individuals agreed to assist you based on long-standing professional relationships developed during your career at the Bureau?" "Yes." "Relationships that the average person would not have access to." "That's likely true. Don't you think that access, those connections, gave your daughter an unfair advantage in this proceeding?" I considered the question. Not because I didn't have an answer, because I wanted the courtroom to feel the weight of the silence before the answer arrived. I had learned, over 61 testimonies, that the most powerful sentences are the ones that follow a pause. Her husband grabbed her in front of their child while his mother applauded. I said, "I'm not certain what the appropriate balance of advantage would be in that situation." Several people in the gallery made a sound. Not laughter. Something closer to recognition. The sound people make when someone says the thing they've been thinking, but couldn't find the words for. Judge Williams looked at me. She didn't quite suppress her expression. It was brief, barely a flicker, but I'd spent 28 years reading micro-expressions, and what I read on her face was the thing judges are trained never to show. Agreement. Kessler looked at his notes. He looked at the judge. He looked back at his notes. "No further questions," he said. He didn't come back to me. In my experience, attorneys abandon a line of cross-examination for one of two reasons. Either they've gotten what they needed, or they've realized that continuing will only make things worse. Kessler had realized the second. The verdict came on a Thursday. Judge Williams read it in a voice that was steady and unhurried. the voice of a person delivering a decision they are confident will hold under appeal. Full custody of Maya Tate awarded to Rachel Morrow Tate, effective immediately. Supervised visitation for Connor David Tate, to be conducted at a court-approved facility, pending completion of a mandatory domestic violence intervention program. The marital residence on Birchwood Lane in Buckhead was awarded to Rachel. Vanessa had demonstrated, through financial documentation assembled by Thomas Birch, that 22 months of mortgage payments had been made from Rachel's personal inheritance from her mother Linda's estate. Connor's attorney had argued that the down payment, provided by Dolores, entitled Connor to a greater share of the equity. Judge Williams disagreed. The house was Rachel's. The court also noted, for the record, that the Fulton County Building Inspector's Office had opened a formal investigation into Tate Construction's active permits, and that the matter had been referred to the State Licensing Board. This was not part of the divorce proceeding, but Judge Williams included it in her remarks, and I understood why. She wanted it on the record. She wanted it documented. She was, in her own way, doing what I had done, making sure the right information was in the right place at the right time. Connor stood when the judge finished reading. His face was white and absolutely still. The face of a man who is processing the distance between the life he had an hour ago and the life he has now. He looked across the courtroom. He looked directly at me. I met his eyes the way I had met them at his dinner table months ago. Without expression, without anger, without triumph. Just the steady gaze of a man who had done what needed doing and was finished. His attorney touched his arm and steered him toward the exit. Connor went. He went the way people go when the ground they were standing on turns out to have been someone else's all along. Dolores was in the gallery. I hadn't seen her come in. She stood slowly, gathered her purse, and walked out without looking at anyone. Her perfume reached me as she passed, trailing behind her like the memory of someone who used to have influence and hadn't yet realized she'd lost it. I found Rachel in the hallway outside the courtroom. She was crying. The real kind. Not the silent, suffocated crying I'd heard on the phone that Wednesday night in the Kroger parking lot. This was open and unguarded. The kind of crying that sounds like someone finally breathing after years of holding it in. Relief. Release. The particular sound of someone discovering that the worst part is over and they survived it. I put my arms around my daughter and held her. She held me back. Over her shoulder, through the tall courthouse windows, I could see the Atlanta skyline against the May sky. Somewhere out there, in Midtown, 400 people were going to work in a building that would soon be properly inspected for the first time. Somewhere in Clarkston, Miguel Reyes was dropping his daughter off at school with a little less weight on his shoulders. And here, in this hallway, my daughter was standing on her own ground for the first time in years, crying the kind of tears that don't sting, the kind that wash things clean. Task 16. My mom is brave. 6 weeks later, I was sitting on Rachel's back porch, watching Maya water her section of the raised garden bed we'd built together on a Saturday afternoon. It had taken us most of the day. I'd measured and cut the cedar planks while Maya held the tape measure with the serious focus of a child who has been given a real job and intends to do it properly. Rachel had mixed the soil. 3 parts topsoil, 1 part compost, 1 part perlite, a ratio Linda had written in the margins of her garden notebook, which Rachel had kept all these years in a kitchen drawer. Maya's section had rosemary and basil. Rachel's had thyme and parsley. Along the back fence, in the spot that caught the most afternoon sun, Rachel had planted sunflowers. They weren't tall yet, just small green stalks with their faces tipped toward the light, trusting that the warmth above them would be worth the growing. The evening was warm. Early Georgia summer, the kind of warmth that settles over everything without rushing. The kind that makes you want to stay outside until the last light is gone. There was a glass of lemonade on the porch railing. The ice had mostly melted. I didn't mind. "How is Connor doing?" Rachel asked. Not with malice. She'd stopped saying his name the way you say something that hurts, and started saying it the way you say something that used to. A fact from a previous chapter. A character who had exited the story. I genuinely don't know, I said. I watched Maya redirect the hose to avoid drowning the basil. She had a careful hand. Linda's hand. That's not my concern anymore. I heard Dolores moved. Florida, I think. To be closer to him. That makes sense. Rachel was quiet for a while. The sprinkler 2 houses down was making its rhythmic arc, the sound of suburban evenings. And somewhere, a child was riding a bicycle down the sidewalk, the tick-tick-tick of a playing card clipped to the spokes. Dad, do you regret any of it? The way you handled it? I thought about it honestly. She deserved an honest answer. Not a comfortable one. I regret that it was necessary, I said. I regret that you were in that house for as long as you were, and I didn't see the full extent of what was happening. I regret that Maya spent years learning things no child should have to learn about the adults in her life. I regret that she stopped speaking. I paused. But the calls I made, the documentation, the people I brought in, Vanessa, Thomas, Miguel, I shook my head. Not one moment of that. Not one single call. You never told me, she said quietly, that you'd been building all of it from that first night. You had enough to carry. I picked up the lemonade. The glass was sweating in the heat. My job was to make sure that when you were ready, everything was already in place. All you had to do was say yes. She leaned her shoulder against mine, the way she used to do when she was Maya's age, and the world had felt too complicated to navigate alone. We sat like that for a moment, watching Maya move between the plants with the hose, humming something under her breath. She was humming. I noted that. 6 months ago, she hadn't been speaking. Now, she was humming in a garden on a summer evening, and the sound of it was so ordinary and so miraculous that I had to look away for a second to keep my composure. Something happened last week, Rachel said. Her voice had changed. Softer now. Careful, but not in the old way. Careful the way people are careful when they're holding something precious and want to set it down gently. Mrs. Anderson called me. I turned to look at her. Maya spoke at school. Rachel's eyes were already filling. For the first time in 4 months, Mrs. Anderson said she'd asked the class to share something about their families. Just one thing. It was a Friday afternoon activity. Low pressure. No grades. The kids were going around the circle. Some talked about their pets. One boy talked about his dad's new truck. And then it was Maya's turn. Rachel stopped. She pressed her lips together. She took a breath. The whole class went quiet. They'd gotten used to skipping Maya. They'd gotten used to her silence. Some of them had stopped, expecting her to participate at all. Mrs. Anderson said she almost moved on to the next child, the way she'd been doing for months. But Maya stood up. I set down the lemonade. She stood up from her chair, Rachel continued, and she looked at Mrs. Anderson, and she looked at the class, and she said 3 words. Rachel's voice broke on the edge of the sentence. She held it together the way she'd learned to hold things together. But this time she was holding it together not because she was afraid of falling apart, but because she wanted to deliver these 3 words to me, the way Maya had delivered them to that classroom. Clearly, deliberately, with the full weight of everything behind them. She said, "My mom is brave." The porch was quiet. The sprinkler kept its rhythm. Maya kept humming. The world kept turning the way it does when something enormous happens inside a moment so small that only the people in it understand its size. That's what she said, Rachel whispered. 3 words. Her first words in 4 months. Mrs. Anderson told me she had to step out of the classroom because she started crying. 3 of the other children clapped. Maya sat back down and folded her hands in her lap, and that was it. She didn't say anything else for the rest of the day. But she said that. I sat very still. I've received commendations from the director of the FBI. I have been cited in federal case law. I have been thanked by families of victims whose cases I helped resolve, after years of silence. None of it, not one moment of professional recognition in a 30-year career, came close to what I felt sitting on that porch, hearing what my granddaughter had said in a second-grade classroom on a Friday afternoon. "My mom is brave." 3 words. In 4 months of silence, my granddaughter had been listening, watching, processing, understanding more than any adult in her life had given her credit for. And when she finally chose to speak, when she reached inside herself and found the voice that had been waiting there all along, she didn't talk about her own fear. She didn't talk about the silence or the shouting or the way her father's hands had looked when they gripped her mother's shoulders. She talked about her mother. She talked about courage. She used her first words in 4 months to tell a room full of 7- and 8-year-olds the most important thing she knew. Her mother was brave, and she was right. Maya turned off the hose and set it down on the grass with the careful precision of a child who has been trusted with a tool and wants to prove she deserves it. She wiped her hands on her shorts and walked across the yard toward the porch. The evening light was behind her, long and golden, the particular light of early Georgia summer that turns everything it touches into something worth remembering. She climbed the porch steps and stood in front of me. Her hair was coming loose from its ponytail. There was a smudge of garden soil on her cheek. She looked at me with Linda's eyes, those deep brown eyes with gold flecks that caught the fading sun. And she took my hand. She squeezed it. Once, twice, 2 squeezes. The same silent language she'd spoken at the front door in Buckhead on the worst night of this story. The same code Rachel had used at my door in Decatur on the night everything changed. But this time it didn't mean "please don't leave us here." This time, standing in the warm light of a garden she'd helped build, it meant something else entirely. It meant we're okay. It meant thank you. It meant I'm here and you're here. And that's enough. "Grandpa," she said. Her voice was clear and unhurried. The voice of a child who had spent 4 months in silence and had come back from it with a new understanding of the weight that words carry. "Did you know that rosemary means remembrance?" "I did know that," I said. "Mrs. Anderson told us. She said people have been planting it for hundreds of years to remember people they love. Like in gardens, and at weddings, and even at funerals." She looked at the raised bed where the rosemary was growing, its thin green stems reaching upward in the way all young things reach, with faith that there's something above them worth reaching for. "Can we plant some more for Grandma Linda?" The question landed in my chest the way only the simplest questions can. Not because it was complicated, because it was exactly right. "We absolutely can," I said. She nodded, satisfied that the matter was settled, and turned back toward the garden. She crouched at the edge of the raised bed and began examining something near the base of the basil plant with the focused attention of a child who has rediscovered the world and is determined not to miss any of it. She was present. She was curious. She was 8 years old and she was free. Rachel leaned her head against my shoulder. She didn't speak. Some moments don't require language. Some moments are complete, exactly as they are, and anything you add to them only makes them smaller. The sun was going down behind the fence, painting the top of the sunflower stalks in amber and casting long shadows across the yard. Somewhere down the street, the neighbor's sprinkler was still making its patient arc. A bird was singing from the magnolia in the front yard, the same species of bird that had sung from the magnolia outside my study window in Decatur on all those late nights when I sat at my desk building something I hoped my daughter would never need and prayed she'd have when she did. I thought about prayer. I'm not a man who talks about faith in large public ways. I've spent my life in the language of evidence and procedure and behavioral science. But sitting on that porch, watching my granddaughter touch the rosemary with dirt-stained fingers, I understood that what I'd done over the past several months had been, in its own way, an act of faith. Faith that the truth, once assembled and placed in the right hands, would do what truth has always done. Faith that my daughter had the strength to walk through the door once I'd built it. Faith that an 8-year-old girl who had lost her voice would find it again, and that when she did, she'd use it to say something that mattered. Grace is a word I don't use often, but I'll use it now. What I felt on that porch was grace. The unearned, unexpected gift of sitting beside my daughter in the evening light and watching my granddaughter grow something in a garden her grandmother had taught us all to tend. We hadn't earned this moment through perfection. We'd earned it through endurance, through showing up, through the stubborn, imperfect, relentless act of loving someone enough to do the difficult thing when the difficult thing was the only right thing left. Somewhere across the city, the gears of consequence were still turning. The OSHA investigation into Tate Construction was proceeding. The Fulton County building inspector had ordered a full structural review of the Midtown office building. Thomas Birch had forwarded his documentation to contacts at the state licensing board. The IRS had opened a preliminary inquiry into the financial discrepancies in Connor's business records. Not at my request. Thomas had simply decided, as a private citizen, that structural fraud and financial irregularities bothered him. I hadn't discouraged him. I hadn't destroyed Connor Tate. I hadn't needed to. I'd simply stopped looking away. And I'd made sure the right people knew where to look. That's not revenge. Revenge is about what you feel. It's loud and hot, and it burns the hand that holds it. What I'd done was quieter than that. Colder, more patient. It was about what my daughter and my granddaughter deserved, which was not vengeance, but safety. Not punishment, but freedom. Not the satisfaction of watching a man fall, but the peace of knowing that the two people I loved most in this world could stand on solid ground. Maya looked up from the garden bed. Grandpa, the rosemary smells like the soap Mommy uses. That's because Mommy buys rosemary soap, Rachel said, laughing softly. You figured out the mystery. I'm a good detective, Maya said. You are, I said. The best I've ever worked with. She grinned. A real grin. The kind that takes up her whole face and makes her look exactly like Linda did at that age in the photographs I keep on my desk in Decatur. Then she turned back to the garden and resumed her investigation of whatever small wonder had captured her attention in the soil. I sat on that porch and I let the evening settle around me. The light was fading. The air was warm. My daughter was beside me. My granddaughter was in the garden. And somewhere, in a house I hadn't visited in months, Linda's garden was waiting for me. I'd go back to it soon. I'd pull the weeds and repair the trellis and plant rosemary along the stone path Maya used to walk like a balance beam. I'd tend it the way Linda would have wanted. Not perfectly, but faithfully. The way you tend anything that matters. Not victory. Not vindication. Just the particular quiet blessing of a man who spent his entire career studying the patterns of dangerous people and who, when it finally mattered most, used everything he knew to protect his own. If this story meant something to you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're listening from. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them. Sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is simply let them know they're not alone. If you want to hear another story, click the one on the left. Thank you for being here.